This is a University of Otago podcast.
Want to contribute towards better policy discussion and debate in the country. They fund our research to address areas of policy significance for the country, things that we think are holding us back, and we produce independent research then on that basis. I came to the initiative in August from after a decade at the University of Canterbury, where I was a lecturer and senior lecturer in economics. So today we're going to be going through a bit of the data on CEO pay and some of the empirical literature on it, whether it's fair or rort. Well, we have to start by thinking about what that's going to mean. So what's fair? Everybody has different notions about what fairness means, whether it's some multiple of employee earnings or some tie to a living wage or some tie to performance. The basis that I'm going to be using here is a CEO is paid way too much if the board could fire him, replace him or her with the next best alternative for less money, and earn more for their shareholders in doing so. There can be all kinds of reasons that that could happen. If you're paying a CEO too much and you think that relativity theory holds and that your employees are just going to be mad that this guy's getting paid so much, so even though he would be worth the money but for that, you're reducing shareholder value by paying him that much, then you should be getting the next best alternative for less money if that's the conditions in your workforce. So under what conditions can we get that kind of CEO overpayment? What has to be true about the world for firms to be throwing money away in paying their CEOs too much? Because it's not like the shareholders just want to throw money at CEOs. Maybe in some crazy firms with no competition or something, they're like a nice gilded ornament, like having a status symbol CEO or something. But I don't think that characterizes most of the business world. Businesses tend to compete with one another. Now, what's going to have to be true? First, you're going to need that board oversight is weak. The board of directors sets the compensation committee. The compensation committee is setting the CEO's pay. If the board is not watching the CEO's performance and is doing a bad job, they might be overpaying him relative to what they should be or failing to fire him or her for bad performance. So that would be a first thing that you'd need. But you need more than that. Because if you've got a poorly performing board, that means that the shareholders are messing up somewhere, that the shareholders aren't watching what their board is doing. So you could get that maybe if you've got very dispersed shareholdings without having somebody that's got like a 10% stake in it. If you've got large KiwiSaver funds, whatever, watching, they're going to be keeping a good eye on things. If you've got very dispersed shareholdings and lack of proxies, maybe they're not going to be watching it as closely as they should be. But really, the market disciplines these kinds of things through the last mechanism, takeovers. If the shareholders are failing to monitor the board, and if the board is failing to monitor the CEOs, then somebody else will see that they could take over the firm, fire the board, fire the CEO, put in place people who know what they're doing for less money, and produce more value. You can buy up all the shares and then sell them later at a profit. So we would need it to be the case that takeovers are hard, as well as the other two conditions for you to have really bad problems with CEO overpay, in my view. Now, we can then use that to start thinking about what sorts of things characterize CEO pay. If it's the case that CEO pay varies by sort of normal things like firm performance or number of direct reports or the size of the firm, revenues, the complexity of the industry, the number of people who have expertise in that area, then those are all sort of reasonable explanations. If they vary more with things like, has the CEO managed to stack the board of directors with his cronies and puts himself in the compensation committee, well, then that would be the other kind of explanation. And we've got a little bit of data that will pertain to these and a bit of New Zealand data as well, thankfully. I would want to start, though, by looking at the difference between American and New Zealand data. New Zealand has this terrible habit of looking at social ills abroad and assuming that the exact same thing holds true here as well. We do it all the time. It shows up in the inequality debates and it shows up in the CEO pay debates. CEO pay multiples here, on average, are roughly where they were in the United States in 1970. They have gone well in excess of that in the United States now. New Zealand, it hasn't. Now, there can be good and bad reasons for that. Maybe it's a lack of shareholder control in the United States, but we'll go through some data suggesting not. Maybe it's that the returns to very top skills for very top executives in very large, complicated firms, well, those skills are more valuable in a global marketplace that's a hell of a lot more complicated than it was 30 or 40 years ago. Firms need to have very top talent more now than they used to, so there's more competition for it. If New Zealand firms are not sufficiently large and not sufficiently globalized to need that kind of top talent, then that 25 or 30 times average in New Zealand might be something to lament rather than something to celebrate. It all depends on the why. We might be a little bit worried if we're not having the kinds of firms that need the kinds of talent to take on the world, right? So we shouldn't just look at these kinds of ratios and then scream about how everything's unfair. Look at a global context, see what's underlying it, and then make some assessments. Now, just in terms of overall data, a little pre-talk survey. Show of hands on how many folks think that inequality has increased substantially in New Zealand over the last 20 years. Hands up for folks who think that it's been like a little bit of an increase in inequality over the last 20 years. Hands up for a moderate amount of inequality increase over the last 20 years. Okay, a few. How much for like really big increases in inequality over the last 20 years? Okay, how much for no increase in inequality over the last 20 years? 1, 2, 3. Okay, you're in a minority. Here's the data. I included this graph in our most recent report, or the most recent report that I was an author on, the Case for Economic Growth that we put out a few months ago and we had a few MPs debating it. This is New Zealand data coming out of Thomas Piketty's database in Paris. So he's hardly some hardcore crazy free marketer who's wanting to hide any increase in top incomes. This is the guy who's complaining about inequality. So this is New Zealand data. If we look at 1953 and set everybody's salary equal to 1 or 100 in 1953, and then trace it out over time, the top 10% and the top 1%, they had a big increase from the mid-80s after the Douglas reforms through to, well, like 99, 2000. And then you got a bit of a spike 99, 2000 because people were bringing forward income because of the incoming top tax rate increase. But since then, stagnant. If you look over the broader period, most of the gains have gone to the bottom 90%, and the gap between the bottom 90% and the top 1%, top 10% has increased over the last 10 years, but not in the way that most of you expected. We are importing American narratives inappropriately, and it is screwing up policy debate here. Because we're thinking that there's this huge problem of mega rich that's the same thing as in the United States. Look to the underlying data. And this, you'll find the exact same thing in work by the Ministry of Social Development. They've put out an annual survey on this. They've got a fantastic statistician over there who does this work every year, compiles up the data, and shows that by whatever measure of inequality you want to have, it was rising through the mid-80s, through mid-90s, flat since then. Whatever increase we had is done with, and it's been flat since then. And that also comes into some of the CEO pay debate. Now, there was a large increase in CEO pay also over that same period that we had increase in pay in the top 1%, but it's not nearly reaching American levels. Now, does CEO pay vary with performance and firm factors or with corporate governance? What do we know? Start with some of the data on pay and what I'll broadly construe as merit. The kinds of things that you think should affect pay, right? How big the firm is, how complicated it is, all that kind of stuff. There's a nice study done in Sweden, very recent, 2015. The Swedes are neat. The Scandinavians in general have fantastic data. So they had data on basically an IQ test of every 18-year-old in the country because of military service. And they were looking then, that all ties in their background databases with the equivalent of IRD data. Like if we think that the stuff that Bill English is doing through the IDI, the integrated data sets, is pretty cool, and it really, really is. The Scandinavians are doing neat stuff too. CEOs that go into the more complicated, bigger firms are drawn from higher parts of the IQ distribution than ones that go into smaller firms. There is sorting by skill across the firms that need skill more. That's consistent with more merit-based arguments about where CEO pay is coming from. Another bit of data. Larger firms do require higher skills. This is American data, Kaplan and Rauh 2013. It is more important for top, huge, complicated firms in globally integrated markets with crazy complicated supply chains to have very, very skillful top CEOs. So they were ascribing most of the increase in CEO pay to that. And if you then look at Gabaix Landier, that came out in the Quarterly Journal of Economics shortly after 2007. 2007 was the working paper version. All of the rise in CEO pay in America, they say, basically comes down to the increase in market capitalization of firms. New Zealand has smaller firms. We have smaller CEO pay. Now, what else do we know? This was a fun study. Nguyen Nielsen looked at unexpected CEO deaths. So somebody who dies by surprise that you wouldn't expect to have died. Like, it's not like some 80-year-old CEO that everybody knows that he's going to be going and his son's going to take over or something in a family-owned firm. These are just like somebody gets hit by a car. Okay? You get big, sharp valuation drops. And they find that the pay that these guys are getting compared to the next best alternative, because the next best alternative is who gets hired after the guy is hit by a car. The CEOs are, on average, returning a fair amount to the firms. So the CEOs do share in those rents with the firm. So the CEO provides value to the firm over and above what he's paid. And he, compared to what the other person would have been paid, some of that gap goes to the CEO. Some of it goes to the firm and shareholders. They share in it. So between the CEOs don't take a small part of it either, but they are returning more to the firms than the next best alternative. And that was the first thing that I started with, right? That we would say it's fair if the CEO could not be replaced by somebody cheaper and provide more value to shareholders in the process. That's consistent with it. Now, there's a lot of variability in that. There are some CEOs who are overpaid in this data, but it wasn't true on average. And again, that speaks to shareholder vigilance. New Zealand data. Tim Hazeldine is presenting he's an Auckland University prof. He's going to be presenting at the New Zealand Economic Association meetings coming up in June in Wellington. June or July, I can't remember now. He was saying that in New Zealand data, sales revenue and the number of direct reports that a CEO has explain about 70% of the variation in CEO pay in New Zealand. So it's just sort of common sense stuff. Big firms are going to need more skilled managers to run them. Glenn Boyle, who's Prof of Finance at Canterbury and a former colleague and a co-author of his, they found in New Zealand data also that pay does vary with performance, but the relationship was fairly weak. So we tend to do more here in base pay rather than performance-based pay, for better or worse. Maybe we just like taking on a little bit less risk here, and the ones who like risk a little bit more ship off to the States and earn risk-based returns there and work a lot harder. Possibly. So both of those are at least consistent with the, well, these guys are kind of earning it explanations. Now, on the other side, what data do we have on the other side? This is nowhere near a complete survey of the literature. This is what I've been able to find so far. Outsiders on boards, okay? Outsiders are people who aren't really affiliated with the company. You bring in an outside director to keep an eye on things. If you've got insiders on the compensation board, you get higher base pay for the managers, less performance pay, which may skew things towards the CEO. And that's both American papers. Within New Zealand, Boyle and Roberts find that, this is a fun one. You'd think this would go the other way, right? So if the chief executive is on the compensation committee, like the committee that decides on everybody's pay, you'd think he'd be voting himself some pay increases, or herself some pay increases. But that doesn't seem to be the case. In Boyle's work, he is finding about a 4% salary penalty to a CEO who is on the pay committee. If we think that CEO pay is because of bad governance and corruption in boards and stuff, you'd expect that to show up when the CEO is deciding on his pay. But instead it's a penalty. I'm finding that a little inconsistent with the corporate rort kind of story. In American data, that's the Murphy and Anderson ones, they were again finding that it lowers base pay, but it also increases stock ownership. And they're finding there that CEOs that sit on the compensation committees basically act more like owner-managers than like external folks. So their incentives get a little better aligned through ownership. So that's some of the data, things that I think we know out of the existing literature, some of which may have been surprising, just like we found that we aren't actually increasing in inequality as a surprise. Now, in terms of firm performance, there can be real trade-offs if employees get angry that others are earning more than them. If employees are very inequality averse, or they make reference to how much they work and how hard they work and compare it to somebody else, and it makes them feel bad, then maybe they'll work less hard. What do we know about this stuff? We find that, this is all out of this one really nice paper by Wade O'Reilly Pollock, CEOs that are overpaid, so how they determine overpayment is they just run some regressions on a bunch of, they use statistical techniques to say, what do we think that the CEO of this company should be making? And if they're making a lot more than that, we're going to call that overpaid. Maybe there's just other stuff that we haven't measured that's what's driving it, but on average, maybe these guys are overpaid. They're finding that the CEOs who are overpaid also tended to overpay their direct reports, which would be consistent with that there's some relativity stuff going on, that you might work less hard if the person against whom you're benchmarking yourself is paid a lot more for not doing a whole pile more. So the ones just under the CEO, he wants them to work harder, he'll pay them more. So that might point to that the costs of excess CEO pay in places that have poor shareholder control might be more than just the CEO's pay. It might go through the management structure. But they also see lower tier turnover, so it only extends down so far. So that can be reason for firms to be watching this. But again, this is American data from 2006. If we recall from the numbers I was putting up before, CEO pay in top American firms relative to average employee compensation was like 200, 300, 400 to 1, like much higher than 25 to 1. It would be a bit of a long bow to say that the results that we're finding in this kind of paper automatically apply to places where it's 25 to 1. Like maybe there's been some New Zealand work on it that I've not found, but I would be pretty nervous about claiming strong relativity effects in New Zealand based on that American data. A few concluding thoughts. If you're mad about CEO pay and you're a shareholder in the firm, watch the reports. Make sure that there's good management in place. Watch your boards. The main reason to be angry about CEO pay is if you are a shareholder in that firm. Because maybe you're getting screwed. But you want to make sure that you are actually being screwed and that they're not paying somebody for really good performance. Public salary data cuts two ways. There was some talk before about how the importance of transparency. Transparency can be really important, but it is a double-edged sword. Seeing increasing they're all anecdotal accounts, but you're seeing them from more and more places. So in the United States, there was a Charles Murray piece that came out just a couple of days ago where he was arguing that because everybody knows CEO pay because of stock market exchange requirements, once everybody knows what everybody's paid, everybody can use that in arguing for their next pay increase. And if no firm wants to admit that their CEO is below average, then you've got Lake Wobegon going on, right? Where all the CEOs are above average. Yeah, So we've got a bit of a problem there potentially, and I have heard the story in New Zealand as well that after the 1993 changes that started requiring CEO pay disclosure in shareholders' interest, you just had this crazy ratcheting up. And I have heard one anecdotal account that I will not name the person that, yeah, it was great. We all found out what everybody else got paid, so we all got a raise. So be careful what legislative things you want to put in to protect shareholders against their boards and CEOs, because it might end up having unintended consequences. And another area, policies nominally protecting shareholders may have fishhooks. Here I'm thinking about takeovers regulation. I'm no securities market expert. What anecdotal accounts I've heard were that the changes that were made to protect shareholders' interests or minority shareholders' interests in the case of takeovers made it really, really hard to run takeovers. And that dried up corporate takeovers. And when you do that, you're breaking the last line of defense we've got against bad governance, right? So we started off boards controlling CEOs, shareholders controlling boards, the market disciplining the whole darn thing. If you make it too hard to run takeovers, you're breaking the last line of defense. We don't want to do that, and we might have done that. And finally, in this and in just about every other data bit relating to social policy, don't automatically assume that American narratives hold here. And if they don't, that it's a good thing, because we don't know that it's a good thing either. Maybe it'd be nice if we had a firm that needed the kind of talent to go everywhere and do everything and take on the world and needed the kind of CEO who could do it. So just a little nervous on that. And that'll be me on my half hour. Thank you.